Somewhere in the last week you said thank you to Alexa, and there's a decent chance you either don't remember doing it or remember it exactly and have been mildly embarrassed about it ever since. A Roomba that got in your way probably got an apology. A car that wouldn't start probably heard you whisper something encouraging to it, and your phone, dropped by accident, may have received a split-second flash of guilt that you didn't entirely choose to feel. Your car might have a name, a full personality maybe, with opinions about traffic. If any of that landed, welcome. And here's the thing you need to understand. None of it makes you weird, and none of it means you spent too much time with devices and not enough time with people. What you're actually running is a piece of cognitive software so ancient and so deeply embedded in how human minds work that it predates language, fire, agriculture, and every god humanity has ever invented. What makes this worth your time is that the behavior you've quietly chalked up to being tired or distracted or just a little soft turns out to be the single most successful cognitive adaptation your ancestors ever produced. And that's not a casual claim. Not useful, not mostly good with some downsides. The most successful, the kind that researchers in cognitive science and evolutionary psychology have argued is a major reason you exist at all. Stick around because by the end of this, you will never look at a wall outlet the same way again, and that is not a figure of speech. Going back means not stopping at ancient Greece or medieval Europe, which are practically yesterday on the timescale we're working with here. The destination is somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, somewhere between 50 and 200,000 years ago, give or take a geological blink. Your ancestor is moving through tall grass at dusk, and let's call him Kip, because naming things is exactly what this video is about. Productivity isn't on his mind. Background processing isn't happening. Kip is thinking about exactly two things: food and not dying, and everything else is noise. And then the grass rustles. Kip now has two available interpretations of what just happened. The first is wind. Just the wind doing what wind does at dusk when the temperature shifts and the air moves. No predator, no problem. The second is something with large teeth and a very recent interest in Kip specifically, about to end his genetic legacy in a fairly definitive way. The decision tree running in real time here has a brutal asymmetry to it. Kip assumes wind, turns out to be right, and nothing happens. He walks on, finds food, and has a fine evening. Kip assumes predator, turns out to be wrong, burns maybe 40 seconds on an ancestry retreat. His heart rate spikes, and if the hominids he was traveling with had anything resembling social awareness, which the evidence suggests they did, he maybe looks a little foolish in front of them. Small cost. Life goes on. But Kip assumes wind and turns out to be wrong, and that's the end of the whole experiment. His genes go nowhere. His line ends. Every version of the future that includes Kip's descendants, including the one where you're watching this right now, collapses into nothing. One of those mistakes is recoverable and one of them is permanent, and that is not a close call. In his 2004 book, Why Would Anyone Believe in God?, cognitive scientist Justin Barrett gave the tendency Kip was running a name that has held ever since: the Hyperactive Agency Detection Device, or HAD. Your brain isn't simply wired to detect agents, things with intentions, things with minds, things whose behavior gets directed by some internal purpose. Your brain is wired to over-detect them, systematically, reliably, even when the conscious part of you knows better. Barrett built directly on earlier work by anthropologist Stuart Guthrie, who published Faces in the Clouds in 1993 with a thesis that was deceptively plain. Human perception is structurally, fundamentally anthropomorphic. Wood grain, toast, cloud formations, electrical outlets, all of them produce faces in the human visual system constantly, a phenomenon called pareidolia, which is HAD's most visual obvious output. But the deeper pattern goes further than faces. Human minds see intention in things, agency in things, and the detection runs automatically before the conscious brain has had any chance to weigh in. None of this is metaphor. What Barrett and Guthrie were describing is a literal neural process, a dedicated hair trigger system for asking whether there's a mind behind this, and that system is biased almost comically toward answering yes. Researchers describe this as asymmetric error cost, which sounds dry until you understand what it meant for Kip. Missing a real predator, a false negative, carried catastrophic costs historically: death, gene termination, evolutionary dead end. Detecting a predator that turned out to be wind, a shadow, a rock with an ambiguous silhouette, a false positive, cost almost nothing: wasted energy, an elevated heart rate, maybe a brief loss of standing if someone in your group witnessed the retreat. And over hundreds of thousands of years, the math did what math does. Brains that ran hot, seeing agency everywhere, assuming minds in shadows, flinching at ambiguous sounds. Those brains survived long enough to build more brains. The brains that ran cool, that demanded more evidence before assigning intention, that looked at rustling grass and concluded probably just wind. Those brains occasionally made the catastrophically costly version of the mistake. You are not descended from the calm ones. This tendency isn't uniquely human, and the evidence for that shows up across species in ways that are hard to dismiss. Corvids, crows, ravens, jackdaws, birds with genuinely impressive cognitive architecture have been studied extensively by Nicola Clayton's research group at Cambridge, which documented their theory of mind and their capacity to model what other individuals know and don't know. What the same research reveals is that corvids are extraordinarily vigilant about agency. A crow encountering an unfamiliar object doesn't ignore it and move on. It watches, investigates, and treats the object as a potential agent, something with intentions worth tracking, until the evidence suggests otherwise. The default assumption is not, probably nothing. The operating question, as far as the crow's behavior suggests, is what does this want, and what does it know? Rhesus macaques carry similar patterns. Primate vigilance studies document a consistent response when animals enter novel environments or encounter ambiguous stimuli, a moving shadow, a displaced object, a sound with no visible source. What follows is not a calm assessment but a social search, a rapid scan for the agent responsible. What made this happen, and does it have intentions that matter to me? The pattern appears across species that share two specific features: sufficient social complexity and sufficient predator pressure, which is what happens when evolution builds a brain navigating a world full of things that have intentions. Competitors, predators, prey, social allies. The answer evolution keeps arriving at is to assume there's a mind there first and update later, if you're still alive to do it. Haiti as a framework explaining why Kip was jumpy would be interesting but contained. What makes it genuinely strange is the fingerprint it left across the entire archaeological and anthropological record, at scales running from a single nervous ancestor in tall grass all the way to the architecture of civilization. The burial record is where that fingerprint becomes hard to ignore. Across dozens of prehistoric sites going back at least 100,000 years and potentially much further, the evidence shows deliberate burial practices, bodies arranged with intention, grave goods, ochre. The Shanidar cave burials in Iraqi Kurdistan dated to roughly 60 to 80,000 years ago, documented Neanderthal remains in positions suggesting ritual arrangement, and there's a famous claim about flower pollen found near the bodies. Some researchers argue the pollen arrived through burrowing rodent activity rather than human placement, and the interpretation is debated. But the debate itself is telling because the context was suggestive enough to require explaining at all. Other sites are less ambiguous: deliberate arrangement of the dead, objects placed near bodies, evidence of preparation, and what all of this requires at minimum is a belief that something about the dead person persisted beyond the body. Some agent, a soul, a spirit, something with intention, continued somewhere and might benefit from having their tools accompany them. Nobody packs belongings for a journey without believing, on some functional level, that a journey is actually happening. Cave art tells a parallel story. Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, with images dating to 35,000 years ago, or more. None of this was random decoration. These were systematically chosen animals depicted in motion, sometimes overlapping in ways that carry the feel of narrative, and some images include ambiguous human-animal hybrid figures that don't fit neatly into any category. Anthropologist David Lewis Williams has argued in detailed comparative work that much of this art connected to altered states and shamanic practice, not merely depicting animals but actively engaging with the spirits of animals, agents with intentions that could be communicated with, bargained with, or appealed to. Contemporary hunter-gatherer anthropology fills in what the artifacts leave out. Animism, the attribution of spirit, intention, and agency to animals, plants, rivers, weather, and rocks, is not a primitive misunderstanding that education corrects over time. Anthropologist Graham Harvey, studying animist traditions across multiple continents, describes animism as a relational practice, a way of engaging with the world that treats most entities as persons, not metaphorically but functionally. That is HHED operating at cultural scale, the same software running exactly as designed. All of that evidence has a reversal hidden inside it we're sitting with. Religious belief, animism, and superstition get discussed as failures of reasoning, cognitive errors, things a more rational or scientifically literate mind wouldn't produce. What the archaeological and anthropological record actually shows is that these are outputs of a system that was working correctly. Your brain isn't broken when it sees a face and wood grain, and it isn't malfunctioning when it attributes intention to coincidence or feels the vague presence of something watching in an empty room at night. It's doing exactly what the most successful cognitive architecture in evolutionary history was built to do. The failure isn't in your brain. The failure is in the assumption that your brain was designed to navigate the world you currently live in, because it wasn't, and everything that follows from that assumption turns out to be wrong. There's a real objection here that deserves a real answer. Some of you are thinking, yes, but you know Alexa isn't alive. At a fully conscious and functional level, you understand that the Roomba is a disc-shaped vacuum with a motor and proximity sensors, not a small creature that deserves an apology. So what is actually happening when you say sorry to it? Isn't this just a conditioned social habit, politeness reflexes firing before the brain has fully processed the situation? That objection is genuine, and part of the answer is yes. The same automatic apology reflex that activates when you nearly walk into a stranger also activates when you nearly kick the Roomba, and that reflex is real and doing some of the work. But the naming isn't accounted for by conditioned social behavior. Nobody accidentally calls their car Gerald because they were on autopilot. The naming is intentional, or at least semi-intentional, and it reflects a genuine attribution of personality, individual identity, something worth distinguishing from other objects of the same type. That is agency attribution. That is HED operating at a level your conscious knowledge of what Alexa actually is doesn't fully override. Nicholas Epley at the University of Chicago spent years researching exactly this. His 2007 paper on Seeing Human, published in Psychological Review, documented in careful detail the conditions under which people attribute minds, emotions, and intentions to non-human things, and his finding was direct. People don't anthropomorphize because they're confused about what is real. The anthropomorphization happens because the mind detection system is always running, always scanning, and it responds to specific cues, motion, apparent responsiveness to behavior, variation that looks like preference as evidence of a mind. Your conscious knowledge that Alexa is a language model sits in a different part of your cognitive architecture than the part that noticed Alexa responded to your voice in a way that felt, in the moment, like being heard. Those two systems don't coordinate in real time. The feeling fires before the correction arrives. What makes this genuinely strange in a slightly vertiginous way is what happens when you watch HED scale from individual cognition all the way up to civilizational architecture. The earliest religious behavior we can document is HED at the individual level. The rustle in the grass becomes a spirit. The river that floods unpredictably acquires an agent behind its behavior, something that might be angry or appeased or reasoned with, and the animal that consistently appears before a successful hunt becomes sacred. Sacredness is essentially what you call the feeling of intentional significance when you can't verify the source. Around 10 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. Agriculture, settlement, surplus, and dramatically larger social groups arrived together. With those larger groups came coordination problems that hadn't existed on the savanna: defection, free riders, anonymity, the difficulty of enforcing cooperation when you can't personally know everyone you're dealing with. And HED scaled to meet those problems. Aaron Norenzayan at the University of British Columbia documented what he calls big gods, the emergence across multiple cultures and civilizations of moralistic, watchful, punishing supernatural agents, and that emergence coincides almost exactly with the emergence of large-scale cooperative societies. Gods who care whether you cheated on your grain tax, gods who are always watching and keeping a record. The timing isn't a coincidence. HED, which started as a predator detection heuristic, got repurposed as a social coordination mechanism at civilizational scale. And the Protestant work ethic, divine punishment, and the persistent feeling of being observed and evaluated even in private are all HED running civilization-level software on hardware that was built for noticing leopards in tall grass. In a development that would confuse everyone involved in that original savanna scene, we have built machines that are specifically and deliberately engineered to trigger HED. Byron Reeves and Clifford Nass at Stanford published The Media Equation in 1996, and their central finding was deeply strange. A series of experiments showed that people responded to computers in fundamentally social ways, applying the same rules and expectations they'd apply to interactions with actual humans. People were polite to computers that had been pleasant to them in previous interactions. Criticizing a computer's performance felt worse when the computer was physically in the same room, compared to when it sat in a different room entirely. People trusted computers using flattering language, and this held even when those people consciously understood the computer was running an algorithm. Reeves and Nass called this the media equation. Human brains, at some automatic processing level, treat media as real and treat media interactions as social. They were right. They couldn't have predicted how far the following 30 years would push that finding. The current version of this isn't people are polite to computers. What we're living with now is machines specifically optimized by teams of engineers drawing on the entire toolkit of human psychology to trigger HAD, voice, conversational response, apparent memory, apparent personality, apparent preference. Alexa doesn't just respond to your voice. Alexa responds in ways that carry all the surface signatures of agency, a mind that's listening, adapting, engaging with you specifically. Your HAD system doesn't have access to your knowledge of large language models. It has access to voice, response to your voice, apparent tracking of context, and variation in response that looks like individual personality, and from those inputs it concludes, correctly by its own criteria, that there's a mind worth engaging with. The thank you said to Alexa last week wasn't a lapse. It was the inevitable output of a system working exactly as designed, encountering an input that was specifically built to trigger it. From far enough away, the mismatch here becomes almost funny. Your brain was built, over hundreds of thousands of years, to answer one question with speed and accuracy. Is there a mind behind this? The environment it was optimized for was full of agents, predators, prey, social competitors, social allies, and getting the question wrong in one direction was catastrophic, while getting it wrong in the other direction cost almost nothing. So the system got tuned hot, toward yes, toward agency, toward mind. Now take that 200,000-year-old predator-sensitive agency detector and drop it into a world full of objects that were specifically engineered, using the entire accumulated knowledge of human psychology to trigger it. Smart speakers that respond to your voice, robotic vacuums that navigate your home with apparent intent, car interfaces that remember your preferences and adapt to them, social media algorithms that respond to your specific behavior in ways that feel personal and timely and strangely like someone is paying particular attention to you. Every one of those systems is, from the perspective of your HAD module, functionally indistinguishable from an agent. Not because you can't tell the difference consciously, but because the part of your brain tagging things as socially relevant doesn't have access to your conscious knowledge. Voice, response, apparent intention, apparent attention. The inputs arrive and the system fires. Your social brain, the system handling relationships, reciprocity, politeness, norms, and the basic mechanics of being a social primate, gets activated because your HAD module just announced that there's a mind in the room. The thank you to Alexa happens because your brain's oldest surveillance system concluded by its own logic and with complete internal consistency that someone worth being polite to was present. The 100,000-year-old security guard in your cognitive architecture looked at the voice coming from the cylinder on your kitchen counter, registered, mind detected, engaged socially, and you engaged socially. That security guard was not wrong by any criteria it was built to apply, running exactly as designed in an environment it was never designed for. There's one thing worth being straight about, because honesty makes this more interesting rather than less. And you deserve more than a story that's slightly too clean. The HAD framework is not universally accepted as the complete explanation for everything described here. Pascal Boyer, who has done extensive work on the cognitive science of religion, argues that what we call religious cognition or anthropomorphism doesn't emerge from a single overactive detector, but from multiple cognitive systems running simultaneously. Agency detection, yes, but also intuitive biology, a system Boyer calls hazard precaution, and social cognition all operating in parallel. The one hyperactive module version is cleaner than the underlying neuroscience may actually support. A counter-argument worth taking seriously goes further. Maybe HAD isn't hyperactive in any meaningful sense. Maybe it's well calibrated for a world genuinely full of agents, and what happens with Alexa isn't the system misfiring so much as an appropriate response to something that shares important functional properties with agents. Alexa does respond to your voice. The Roomba does navigate obstacles in ways that require solving some of the same computational problems an intentional agent would solve. What it actually means to have a mind remains one of the most genuinely open questions in philosophy and neuroscience, far from settled, and your HAD system may be operating more rationally than the prehistoric glitch framing implies. What nobody seriously disputes is this. The evolved tendency to attribute agency is real, documented across cultures, ages, and educational backgrounds, and it doesn't switch off reliably in the presence of technology that triggers the relevant cues. People who understand exactly how language models work still name their smart speakers. Engineers who build robots still feel something when those robots are mistreated in demonstrations. The behavior is consistent. The exact architecture behind it has more room for debate than any single tidy explanation allows. And that's the honest version. Back to Alexa, back to the Roomba, back to Gerald, or whatever name your car goes by in those moments when you're talking to it, which you are. And judgment here is cosmically misplaced, so none of that is coming. What you do when you thank a machine, apologize to a robot, or catch yourself getting genuinely frustrated at technology for what it did on purpose is not a sign of weakness or confusion or too much time spent with devices. That response is the output of the most successful neural architecture ever to run on this planet. The software that kept every single one of your ancestors alive long enough to become an ancestor. The system that when it misfired toward false alarm cost almost nothing, and when it failed to fire and should have, cost everything. Running right now, inside you is a 100,000-year-old predator detector, and the world around it is full of machines specifically engineered to look exactly like predators to that detector. Both systems are working exactly as intended, which is the wild and slightly haunting part. The machines are doing precisely what their designers built them to do, and your brain is doing precisely what 200,000 years of catastrophic selective pressure built it to do. They just weren't designed with each other in mind. The rustle in the grass turned out to be Alexa, and Kip, God rest his probably extremely jumpy soul, would have said sorry to her too. Leave this one in the comments, because the answer is genuinely interesting. When was the last time you caught yourself anthropomorphizing something, talking to a machine, naming an object, getting irrationally annoyed at technology for what it did on purpose, and what was it? What's worth finding out is whether knowing the mechanism makes you notice it more in the next week, or whether HAD runs fast enough that it fires before you ever get a chance to catch it. Subscribe if you want to keep understanding why your brain and body do things that make no sense in the modern world, because there's a lot more of this coming.